Most people picture the dragon of Revelation as a monstrous figure of pure fantasy, a nightmare pulled from a fevered mind, stranded on a Greek island. The truth is different. What John of Patmos actually wrote demanded a specific reading key that his first audience carried in their bones. This is the story you were not told. The image is burned into the Christian imagination. A great red dragon, enormous, coiled in the sky, with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 royal crowns pressed against each brow. His tail sweeps 1/3 of the stars from heaven and hurls them down. He stands before a pregnant woman clothed with the sun, waiting to devour her child the moment it is born. Revelation 12, verses 3 and 4. Every detail was chosen. Every number carried weight. Nothing in that vision was random. To understand what John was saying, you have to travel back almost 2,000 years to a specific rocky outcrop in the eastern Aegean Sea, roughly 70 kilometers off the western coast of what today is Turkey, the island of Patmos, barely 34 square kilometers of arid stone. A Roman penal colony where political prisoners were dumped and forgotten. According to the 2nd century church historian Irenaeus of Lyon, John was exiled there under the Emperor Domitian, around the year 95 of the Common Era. He was, by tradition, close to 90 years old, his body worn out, his companions dead or scattered. The 7 churches of Asia Minor he once shepherded were under pressure that grew heavier by the month. The weight of that pressure needs to be understood on the ground, not in the abstract. Under Domitian, the imperial cult had reached a level of enforced intensity, unmatched by any emperor before him. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, in official correspondence. Refusing to burn a pinch of incense before his image was not a matter of personal conviction. It was treason. And treason carried a specific penalty: confiscation of property, exile or death by beast, blade or fire. In the city of Smyrna, believers were reduced to begging in the streets after their assets were seized. In Pergamum, one man named Antipas had already been executed, and Revelation 2 verse 13 names him directly. In Ephesus, the great temple of Artemis loomed over commerce and forced every merchant into ritual entanglement with the local pantheon. In Laodicea, the pressure came softer, wrapped in wealth and comfort, which was in some ways worse. This was the world for which John was writing. Into that world, he sent a scroll that looked on the surface like a cascade of surreal imagery. Beasts, bowls, trumpets, seals, a woman on a scarlet beast, locusts with human faces, a rider on a pale horse. Modern readers often approach this text as a puzzle box of end times prediction. That is not how the original audience read it, not even close. Apocalyptic literature was a known genre. It had rules, it had conventions. It had a vocabulary of symbols that ancient Jewish and early Christian readers recognized on sight, the same way you recognize a stop sign without needing to sound out the word. The dragon with 7 heads was not an alien monster. It was a specific rhetorical construction, drawing on layers of tradition stretching back more than 1,000 years. Layer 1 was the ancient chaos monster. In the mythologies of the ancient Near East, the sea and the storm were populated by many-headed serpents that embodied chaos itself. Around 1,500 years before Christ, the Ugaritic texts recovered from the ruins of Ras Shamra in modern Syria describe a creature named Lotan, a twisting serpent with 7 heads, defeated by the storm god Baal. Farther east, the Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish tells of Tiamat, the primordial sea dragon, whose body is split by the god Marduk to form the world. The Hebrew scriptures know this creature and rename him. Leviathan, Psalm 74 verses 13 and 14, praise the God of Israel because he broke the heads of Leviathan in pieces. Not one head, heads, plural. Isaiah 27 verse 1 prophesies that the Lord will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent, Leviathan the twisting serpent, and slay the dragon that is in the sea. By the 1st century, any reader steeped in the Hebrew Bible would encounter the seven-headed dragon of Revelation and hear an immediate echo. This was chaos incarnate. This was the primordial enemy of order and creation. This was the thing God had been dismantling since before the foundation of the world. Layer 2 was Daniel 7, roughly 600 years before John. A Jewish visionary living under the Babylonian and Persian empires composed the book of Daniel. In chapter 7, he sees 4 beasts rising from the sea: a lion with eagle's wings, a bear devouring ribs of flesh, a leopard with 4 heads, and a 4th beast, terrible and dreadful, with iron teeth and 10 horns. Count them, 4 beasts. 3 of them combined have 7 heads, 1 + 1 + 4. Add the 4th beast and its 10 horns. You now have, embedded in Daniel, the exact numerical signature that reappears in Revelation 12, 7 heads and 10 horns. That is not coincidence. John was telling his readers, in a language they knew fluently, that the dragon he saw was the sum of every oppressive empire that ever crushed the people of God: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and a 4th power still standing at the moment of writing, Rome. But he did not stop there. The dragon was not merely a political symbol. Revelation 12 verse 9 closes the vision with a hammer stroke. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. Political power was the outer skin. Spiritual rebellion was the inner marrow. The two were wrapped around each other and could not be separated. Centuries of study by Jewish and Christian interpreters have gone into unpacking that single verse. Layer 3 was the 7 hills. 9 chapters later, in Revelation 17, John returns to the 7 heads and gives an unusually direct interpretation. Verse 9 states, "The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated." Verse 10 continues, "They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come." Rome was famously the city of 7 hills. Every literate resident of the empire knew that. Palatine, Aventine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, Caelian. The poet Virgil, writing more than 100 years before John, had already immortalized the phrase septem colles, 7 hills. Coins minted under Vespasian, roughly 25 years before Revelation was composed, showed the goddess Roma seated on the 7 hills, gathered together like a fist. John's audience did not need a footnote. When they read 7 heads and 7 mountains in the same passage, the arrow pointed in one direction and one direction only. The empire that ruled their world, that taxed their crops, that executed their friends, that demanded worship of its emperor. That was one head of the dragon, but only one, because the dragon had 6 others, the 5 that had fallen, the 1 that was, and the 1 still to come. Scholars have argued for almost 20 centuries over the identity of those 7 kings. The most common reading among historians of the early church is that the sequence maps onto specific Roman emperors, most likely starting with Julius Caesar or Augustus and running through the Julio-Claudian and Flavian dynasties. Count Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero as the 5 fallen. Count Vespasian, or by other reckonings Domitian, as the 6th reigning. The 7th, brief and yet to come, remains a matter of debate. Silence. That is often the most honest response when a text refuses to yield a single interpretation. John's genius, and part of what has kept Revelation alive for almost 2,000 years, was writing a vision that named a specific empire in his own moment and simultaneously spoke to every empire that would rise afterward. Every empire that arrogates worship, every empire that persecutes the vulnerable, every empire that seats itself on hills and demands loyalty unto death, all of them are heads of the same dragon. That is layer 4, and it is where the symbolism becomes most uncomfortable. The number 7 throughout the Bible signifies completeness. 7 days of creation, 7 feasts, 7 branches of the menorah, 7 churches addressed at the start of Revelation. When the dragon is given 7 heads, John is not saying he had a specific count of physical craniums. He is saying the dragon represents the totality of anti-divine power across time, a fullness of opposition, every possible form the enemy could take. The 10 horns amplify this. Horns in Hebrew symbolism represent political and military might. 10, another number of fullness in a different key, indicates the complete scope of that might. Together, 7 heads and 10 horns describe an entity that occupies every position of coercive authority across every era. And the 7 diadems, the royal crowns pressed against the dragon's brows, complete the accusation. This was not usurpation attempted in secret. This was illegitimate rule proclaimed openly. Every throne, every scepter, every act of worship demanded by force is another jewel in the dragon's crown. You can see now why the vision terrified and consoled at the same time. Terrified because the enemy was not a single emperor who would eventually die. He was a pattern that would keep resurfacing. Consoled because Revelation 12 does not end with the dragon triumphant. Verse 7 describes a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fight against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fight back, and the dragon does not prevail. There was no place found for them any longer in heaven. He is thrown down to the earth, and his angels are thrown down with him. The dragon is real. The dragon is powerful. The dragon has already lost. To grasp the full weight of that promise, you have to consider what it cost the first readers to believe it. Under Domitian, records preserved by later historians, including Eusebius of Caesarea, suggest that thousands of Christians and Jews were subjected to legal harassment, property seizure, and in some cases execution. The historian Cassius Dio reports that even members of the imperial family were charged with atheism, a technical term used for those who refused to worship the state gods. Domitian's own cousin, Flavius Clemens, was executed on that charge around the year 95, the same year traditionally assigned to the composition of Revelation. For a small community of believers, mostly poor, mostly living in cramped urban apartments called insulae, the pressure was constant. If you refused to burn incense to the emperor's image, you could lose your business overnight. If you were a slave, you could be whipped. If you were a freedman, you could be exiled. If you were a Roman citizen, you could be beheaded. Weeks of interrogation, months of trials, years of watching neighbors quietly conform. Into that grinding weight, a scroll arrived from Patmos. Read aloud in the flickering light of oil lamps to gatherings of perhaps 30 or 40 believers at a time. And the scroll said, "The dragon that you fear is not what he appears. He is the same ancient serpent your ancestors sang about defeating in the Psalms. He has 7 heads because he cannot help himself. He crowns his heads because he cannot bear to be ignored. And he stands before the pregnant woman, jaws open, waiting to devour her child, because he already knows the child will end him. The child, Revelation 12 verse 5 states, is caught up to God and to his throne. The dragon is left screaming at an empty sky. None of that is accidental phrasing. The Greek used to describe the dragon's failure in Revelation 12 is deliberately anticlimactic. He rages. He pursues the woman into the wilderness. He makes war on the rest of her offspring, but he does not win a single decisive battle in the entire chapter. Every escalation is met with divine provision. The woman is given eagle's wings. The earth opens and swallows the flood he sends. His time is short, and the text says so plainly. That layered over everything else is what makes Revelation 12 one of the most subversive texts ever written under imperial rule. It named the empire without naming it. It exposed the dragon without triggering immediate arrest, because the language was so densely coded that only initiates could unpack it. It handed persecuted people a lens through which to view their own suffering not as random misfortune, but as participation in a cosmic drama already being won. You need to feel the audacity of that move. A 90-year-old prisoner on a rock in the Aegean with no political power, no army, no wealth, and no realistic hope of returning to his community, wrote a document that would outlast the emperor persecuting him by more than 1900 years. Domitian was assassinated within 1 year of Revelation's likely composition. The Roman Empire in the West collapsed roughly 380 years later. The Roman Empire in the East lasted until 1453 of the Common Era, and the scroll John wrote is still being read tonight in thousands of languages on every continent on Earth. That is what the seven heads meant. Not a prediction of a specific future Antichrist to be identified in the 21st century. Not a puzzle to be solved by matching heads to modern nations, but a diagnosis of every empire that has ever existed, and a promise about what awaits every empire yet to come. The dragon is not a monster you find in a bestiary. The dragon is the accumulated shape of every system that has ever demanded ultimate loyalty from human beings. It has 7 heads because it always regenerates. It has 10 horns because it never runs out of weapons. It wears 7 crowns because it insists in every generation on being called Lord and God. And it always loses. Some historical footnotes deserve attention here because they sharpen the picture. The book of Revelation was contested for centuries within the early church itself. Bishops in Alexandria, most notably Dionysius in the 3rd century, questioned whether it should be included in the canon. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the early 4th century, classified it among the disputed books. Its full acceptance in the Eastern churches did not solidify until roughly 600 years after it was written. Part of the resistance came from the abuse of the text. Almost from the beginning, Christian groups tried to identify the 7 heads with specific contemporary rulers, always claiming their own generation was the last. In the 2nd century, Montanists in Phrygia declared that Christ would return in a specific town. In the 11th century, radical preachers identified the 7 heads with the German emperors. In the 16th century, reformers named popes. In every generation since, someone has published a chart claiming to have finally solved it. They were, in a certain sense, all right and all wrong. Right, because every one of those figures could plausibly be described as a head of the dragon in John's sense. Wrong, because the vision was never about narrowing down to one figure. It was about recognizing the pattern. That is the crucial move. Once you see the pattern, you stop being surprised. You expect the dragon to appear in new heads with new crowns in every century. You expect him to demand incense in new forms. You expect him to promise prosperity in exchange for loyalty. And you also expect him to lose again and again, because the child was already caught up to the throne. The archaeology of 1st century Asia Minor supports the reading with brutal specificity. Excavations at Ephesus have uncovered the massive temple of Domitian, dedicated during his reign, with a colossal statue of the emperor, roughly 7 meters tall, taller than 2 stacked adult giraffes. Coins from Pergamum show Domitian being crowned by the goddess Roma. Inscriptions from Smyrna record oaths of loyalty that included divine titles. The imperial cult was not abstract theology. It was carved in marble, minted in silver, and enforced by soldiers stationed in every provincial capital. Against that machinery, John set a text with no soldiers, no marble, no silver. Just a dragon with 7 heads, described so precisely that anyone paying attention could see whose face was pressed into every crown. The image of the woman clothed with the sun, standing on the moon, crowned with 12 stars, has been interpreted across 2 millennia as Israel, as Mary, as the Church, as all three simultaneously. Rabbinic literature from around the same period used similar imagery for the covenant community, giving birth to messianic hope. Early Christian writers layered Mary onto that community without erasing the older reading. Medieval art fused everything together until the image became inseparable from Catholic iconography. All of those readings share one core insight. The dragon stands before the woman because he understands, more clearly than most of his human agents ever will, that the child she carries represents the end of his rule. That is why he rages. That is why he pursues. That is why he wears every crown he can seize. He is losing, and he knows it. The final layer of the symbolism, and perhaps the most important, is what Revelation 12 reveals about time itself. The vision does not sit neatly in the past or the future. Verse 17 describes the dragon making war on the rest of the woman's offspring, defined as those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. That is present tense, ongoing, addressed to the readers in the first century and to every reader since. You are, whether you claim the label or not, standing inside that vision when you read it. The dragon is described in the sky above your own century. His head still wears crowns, his tail still sweeps stars, and the promise still stands. He was thrown down. Silence. The book of Revelation ends, 12 chapters later, with a new heaven and a new earth, with no more sea, which in ancient Jewish imagination meant no more chaos, no more dragon, no more Leviathan. The very element from which the seven-headed monster emerged is erased. Not just the dragon defeated, but the ocean of chaos that spawned him drained to nothing. That is the trajectory the seven heads point toward. Every crown removed, every head severed, every empire dissolved back into the dust from which it rose, and a city descending from above, its measurements given in stadia that translate to more than 2,000 kilometers along each edge, wider than the distance from London to Rome, with gates that never close, because there is no longer any enemy to bar out. John of Patmos never saw that city with his eyes. He died, according to tradition, in Ephesus around the year 100, an old man surrounded by a handful of disciples. He never saw the fall of Rome. He never saw the councils that would eventually place his strange, coded, dragon-haunted scroll into the Christian canon. He never saw the languages his words would be translated into, the cathedrals decorated with his imagery, the peoples on continents he did not know existed, reading his vision by lamplight and by phone screen. He wrote a scroll about a dragon with 7 heads and mailed it to 7 small churches on the edge of an empire that would eventually forget its own name. And the scroll outlived the empire. That is what happens when human effort aligns itself with something larger than the crown of the moment. The crown falls, the head is cut, the dragon staggers back, and what looked like fragile ink on fragile parchment turns out to have been the more durable material all along. The 7 heads are still there in the text. Anyone can open Revelation 12 tonight and count them, but now, when you count, you know what you are counting. Not a prediction, not a puzzle, a pattern. The pattern of every power that ever demanded to be called Lord and God, and the promise that the pattern is already broken. That is the code of Apocalypse 12. And once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it in any headline, in any regime, in any voice that asks for ultimate loyalty. The dragon reappears with new faces. The crowns are remolded. The horns are resharpened, and every time, from a corner too small to matter, someone with no army writes something true, and the empire begins, slowly and invisibly, to lose another of its heads.